The house was too quiet. Not the kind of silence that soothed, but the kind that sat heavy in the air, pressing against the walls like it didn't belong. I had lived with Daniel long enough to recognize the difference. When he was home, there was always something. Music humming softly from his laptop, the scent of coffee lingering late into the evening, the subtle warmth of his presence. But tonight, all of that was gone. He had left that morning for a weekend business trip, his goodbye kiss perfunctory, his voice filled with that same rehearsed affection I'd grown used to. Take care. Love you, 3 words that used to make my heart race but now felt like an obligation. I had barely registered the moment before the door shut behind him. James arrived an hour later. The last time I saw my little brother, he was just that little, awkwardly tall for his age, his movements unsure, his words too eager. But the man standing at my doorstep now was different. He leaned against the frame, one hand shoved into his coat pocket, dark hair falling just enough to frame sharp, deliberate features. His confidence unsettled me, though I couldn't quite say why. You gonna let me in, or should I sleep on the porch? His voice was teasing, familiar in the way only family could be. I exhaled, stepping aside. Still dramatic, I see. He smirked, brushing past me, bringing the chill of the autumn night inside. He dropped his bag carelessly by the couch, stretching his arms over his head. Nice place. Feels precise. Daniel likes order. The words left my mouth before I had time to filter them. James shot me a look, but didn't say anything, only nodding as he wandered toward the kitchen. I watched him move. How his shoulders had broadened, how his once too large clothes now fit just right. It was a strange thing, noticing your brother as if for the first time, like meeting a version of him you had no part in shaping. Beer? He asked, already reaching into the fridge. Sure. He handed me one, then flopped onto the couch, his long legs stretching out like he owned the place. I sat across from him, watching as he took a slow sip, his gaze drifting over the room. So, how's Daniel? Fine. A beat of silence. That convincing, huh? I frowned, tipping my bottle to my lips. Not everything needs to be discussed, James, right? Just like how you haven't asked why I'm suddenly visiting after all this time. I met his eyes then. Dark, unreadable. There was something behind them, something unsaid. But I wasn't ready to pry. Not yet. James sighed, leaning back against the couch. Okay, no heavy talk tonight. Just drinks, bad TV, and... He reached for the remote, flicking through channels before settling on something mindless. Bonding. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Bonding. Sure. For a while, it worked. The television flickered between late-night reruns and crime dramas, neither of us really paying attention. We talked about everything and nothing, his job, my work, the inevitable recollections of childhood mischief. It was easy, slipping into old rhythms, pretending distance hadn't settled between us over the years. It was only when James stretched, his shirt riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of skin, that something inside me shifted. It was a fraction of a second, a meaningless movement. But my breath hitched, and James noticed. His eyes flickered toward me, just briefly, before he shifted, pulling his hoodie over his head. The air felt heavier. I looked away, focusing on the condensation forming on my beer bottle. I was being ridiculous. I forced a chuckle, shaking my head. Still act like you own every room you walk into. James grinned, but there was something behind it now. A knowing. You used to say it was charming. I scoffed. I said it was obnoxious. Same thing. His gaze lingered a second too long. I cleared my throat, standing. It's late. You taking the guest room or the couch? He hesitated, then stretched again, this time deliberately lazy. Guest room. My back's too fragile for a couch these days. Right? I muttered, turning before he could catch the thoughts forming where they shouldn't. James stood, grabbing his bag and brushing past me toward the hallway. As he walked, his fingers skimmed my arm. Light, barely there, but intentional. I swallowed hard. Night, big brother, he murmured, disappearing into the dark. I didn't respond, because for the first time in my life, I didn't know what I was supposed to say. I lay on my side, staring at the red glow of the alarm clock, listening to the quiet hum of the house. James was down the hall, the guest room door slightly ajar, a thin line of golden light cutting through the darkness. He had left it open, or maybe he had forgotten to close it. I turned onto my back, exhaling slowly, forcing myself to ignore the way my skin still buzzed from the brief touch of his fingers hours ago. It was nothing, a meaningless brush. Except it wasn't. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, pressing my palms into my thighs. This was ridiculous. I had spent years building a life with Daniel, anchoring myself to stability, to routine. I loved him. That was the truth, wasn't it? But another truth, one I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge, sat like a weight in my chest. Love shouldn't feel like restraint. A muffled sound broke the silence. I frowned, standing. It came from the living room, a soft shuffle, the clink of a bottle against glass. James! I hesitated for half a second before stepping out of the room, padding barefoot down the hallway. The house felt different at night, the walls pressing in closer, the air heavier. James sat on the couch, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. He glanced up as I entered, a slow, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Couldn't sleep either? I exhaled through my nose, rubbing the back of my neck. Something like that. He lifted the bottle in offering. Want some? I hesitated, then nodded. I sank onto the opposite end of the couch, the leather cool against my skin. James poured a generous amount into a glass and slid it toward me. Don't tell me Daniel keeps you on a leash. I shot him a sharp look. That's not what this is. He laughed softly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Relax. Just messing with you. But his eyes held something else, something unreadable. I took a sip, the burn spreading through my chest. The silence stretched between us, thick with words neither of us wanted to say. James broke it first. Do you ever wonder if you made the wrong choice? I stilled, my grip tightening around the glass. What? He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. You and Daniel. You always seemed sure, even when you were younger. But I don't know, man. I look at you now, and I don't see certainty. My pulse thrummed at my throat. That's not fair, isn't it? His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Because I see it. I see the way you hesitate before you talk about him. The way your shoulders tense when he calls. The way you look at me like you're trying not to. I open my mouth, asterisk to argue, to deny, to say anything that might make this moment less dangerous, asterisk. But nothing came. James smiled, slow and knowing. You don't have to admit it. He moved closer, his knee barely brushing against mine. A choice. A boundary I should have set, asterisk. I didn't move. The room felt too warm, the whiskey humming in my veins. This is insane, I muttered, more to myself than to him. Is it? His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. Or is it just something you've been too afraid to admit? His fingers brushed my wrist, deliberate this time, lingering. I swallowed hard. James. He tilted his head, studying me. Tell me to stop. I should have. I could have. Instead, I sat there, letting the moment stretch, letting the temptation sink its claws into me, letting myself wonder, asterisk for the first time in years, what it would feel like to choose differently, asterisk. The night stretched between us, electric and dangerous. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And then James smirked, pulling away first, breaking the spell with a casual ease that left me breathless. He stood, running a hand through his hair. Go to bed, big brother. He walked down the hall without looking back. And I sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been, heart hammering in my chest, knowing I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. The days blurred together after that night. The space between James and me grew thick with an unspoken tension, a quiet war waged behind every glance, every awkward silence. Neither of us acknowledged what had passed. No apologies, no confessions. But it lingered. I could feel it in the air, like a storm pressing in from the horizon. The weight of it suffocated me, turning everything I did into a performance, a charade. I went through the motions of normalcy, feeding the dog, making meals, pretending to enjoy the small talk that came so naturally when Daniel was around. But inside, I was falling apart. James, on the other hand, seemed strangely unaffected. It was as if the walls we had built between us had never existed. He still called me Big Brother, still teased me about my workaholic habits, still laughed at my tired jokes. But there was something behind his smile now. An edge. It was the third night after the incident. I couldn't sleep again, my mind swirling in a chaos of guilt and confusion. I found myself standing in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise silent house. The whiskey bottle I had been avoiding stared at me from the counter. I picked it up without thinking, pouring myself a drink. It burned down my throat, spreading warmth through my chest, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside me. A soft knock on the doorframe. I froze. James stood in the doorway, his presence somehow filling the entire space. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that I couldn't escape. "I thought you were avoiding this." His voice was low, teasing, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite decipher. "Don't," I said, setting the glass down. "Don't what?" he asked, stepping into the room. I couldn't breathe. "You know what I mean?" James took a slow breath, his eyes softening just a fraction. "You've been running from this, haven't you? From me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I wanted to shout, to demand he take it all back, to apologize for that moment of weakness, but I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know how to fix this, how to undo what had happened between us. His gaze never wavered, and in that moment, the distance between us felt like it had collapsed, as if we were standing at the edge of something we both knew was wrong but couldn't pull ourselves away from. "You think I don't feel it too?" James said softly, his voice thick with something I couldn't name. "You think I don't know this tension? That I don't see the way you look at me sometimes?" I couldn't meet his eyes. You don't need to say anything," he cut in, his voice steady, surprisingly calm. "But it's not about what's happened, is it? It's about what hasn't happened. What we've been avoiding." My heart hammered in my chest. I opened my mouth again, but no words came. I wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to the guest room, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But even as I thought it, I realized, I didn't want him to leave, James moved closer, his step slow but sure. He reached for the empty glass, his fingers brushing mine as he poured himself a drink. "You've been living this life with him," he said, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "But have you ever really been alive in it?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It echoed in my chest, rattling loose pieces of the life I had been trying so hard to hold together. The doubts I'd buried for so long, the longing I had ignored for years, suddenly came flooding to the surface. "Stop," I whispered, the words thick in my throat. "Don't make me do this. Don't make me choose." James let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You don't have to choose, not yet. But you can't keep pretending like everything's fine." I felt a sharp pang of guilt twist in my gut, but it was quickly followed by a flash of something else. Something dangerous. My pulse quickened, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer to him. His eyes darkened, and the space between us seemed to disappear entirely. I opened my mouth to speak, to push him away, but the words died on my lips as I saw the way he was looking at me, full of longing, full of something unspoken that hung heavy in the air. James, the name felt wrong on my tongue, as if I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. He took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "I know you feel it too, and maybe that scares you. But it's there, and you can't keep pretending it isn't." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The only thing I could focus on was the closeness between us, the heat of his body, the way his breath came in shallow gasps. Then, without thinking, I reached out, fingers brushing his arm. A shudder ran through me as our eyes met. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running. I didn't feel the weight of the guilt I had carried for so long. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And, just as quickly, I realized I was in deeper than I ever intended to be.